Okay, so in this segment, we're going to discuss more your ingredients for quick breads, cakes, cookies, muffins, biscuits, pancakes, those type of breads. So last segment, we talked about yeasted breads, hard wheat, soft wheat. In this segment, we're going to be focusing mostly on soft wheat. Soft wheat, again, as a refresher, is your high moisture, lower protein grain, because you don't really want that protein gluten development in your cakes, cookies, muffins, pancakes, those type of breads. You don't want that stretch and that, and you don't need it necessarily. It's funny, I always tell people, if you think about it logically, hard wheat is grown more in your colder, drier climates, breadbasket states of America. Soft wheat is grown more in your wetter, warmer climates, and soft wheat is really the only type of wheat that can grow here in the southeastern United States. I mean, outside of rye and some other varieties of wheat. But soft wheat is what we get. So if you think about it, why are southern states and southern traditions more centered around biscuits, cakes, cookies? I don't think there's a southern grandma out there that doesn't have a famous cake recipe under, that she's known for. So think about that logically. Soft wheat, cakes, cookies, biscuits, pie dough will work much better. Now, I do have to say this, for the first 3 years of my milling life, I only had hard red wheat, and I made everything that was made from flour, because when we switched completely. So it will work, but once I discovered soft wheat, I noticed the texture of my cakes, the texture of my cookies was more moist, not as crumbly, and not as dense. So that's what soft wheat will do for your cakes, cookies, muffins, pancakes, pie dough, biscuits. So let's talk about soft wheat. Again, we talked about the packaging, the way we package grains here at Bread Becker, so I'm not going to go over that again. But if you know your family is going to make a lot of cakes, biscuits, cookies, muffins, brownies, those types of things, I would recommend getting a big bucket of soft wheat. This is the cheapest and most economical way to buy the grains. I love red lids on my red wheat, white lids on my white wheat, and I'm very patriotic, so I put a blue gamma lid on my soft wheat. So that's just some ideas for you of purchasing soft wheat. Now again, we have it in the 2-pound bags, and we have it in the 1-gallon pail. So whatever works for you financially, economically, just know though, the cheapest, most economical way is going to always to buy the big 6-gallon bucket, and know it is storable. So anyway, that's the best way to buy your soft wheat. Again, do not put your baggies just in your pantry unprotected. Now, just like with hard wheat, there's 2 varieties, red wheat and white wheat. With soft wheat, at Bread Becker's, we do have 2 varieties of soft wheat. We have soft white and we have soft red. Soft white is the predominant soft wheat that I use. And just like in the hard wheat variety of red and white, red is more flavorful, white is more mild and bland. So if you're making grandma's pound cake or a white cake or some type of cake or cookie or pie dough or biscuit that you don't want a lot of flavor, then the soft white wheat is going to be your choice. Now here at Bread Becker's, our soft red wheat is Georgia grown. We don't always have it on hand, but we can get it most of the time. So it is in stock most of the time, but just know it is organic and it's Georgia grown. All of our soft wheat here at Bread Becker's is organic. So the red wheat here, if I'm making an oatmeal cookie that I like that rich nutty flavor, or a muffin or a pancake that I love that rich flavor of the red wheat, soft red wheat is gonna give me that soft texture, fluffier texture, and but give me that red wheat flavor that I love. Now, if you make your pancakes or waffles out of soft white wheat, your kids probably won't even know that it's not white flour. So that's a great way to ease your family into the whole idea of freshly milled grains. So that is soft wheat. Remember, high moisture, low protein for your non-yeasted breads. So let's talk about sweeteners again here. So for sweeteners, for my muffins, my coffee cake, now I don't put sweetener in pancakes, but if you do, those types of quick breads, a bread that doesn't use yeast is called quick bread. Maybe we should go over that first. I kind of jumped to the sweeteners because they were right here beside me. But let's go over what is our leavening in a quick bread. Unlike yeasted breads that take time for that yeast to feed on the wheat and produce that carbon dioxide, and that's what enables the bread to rise, and that's why you have to let it sit for a while to rise. Quick breads are called just that because they use baking powder. Oftentimes they may add some baking soda as well, but the baking powder is the predominant leavening in your quick breads. And it's instant. As soon as that baking powder hits the liquid, or the liquid hits the baking powder, it is activated. And that dough, your batter or whatever, will begin to rise immediately. And then again, in the oven, it will rise even more. So that's why it's called a quick bread. So baking powder, a non-aluminum baking powder, is what you're going to use in your quick breads. And like I said, some recipes may call for some baking soda as well. If you use baking soda, you've got to have some type of acid. Honey is acid, but typically in those recipes, you'll have some buttermilk or yogurt or something like that. But for just your basic quick breads, your baking powder is what's going to be the leavening. Again, it produces carbon dioxide, but it's instant as soon as that batter is wet. You need to, when you're making quick breads, you always want to mix your baking powder, baking soda, salt, and any spices or whatever in with your flour. Get it good and mixed in, because like I said, as soon as this baking powder gets wet, it clumps up and it's activated. So you don't want clump of baking powder or your leavening just hitting, you want it distributed throughout that flour so you don't get that clump of baking powder. But anyway, so that's the leavening. Again, I use real salt in all my recipes, so that we're not going to go over that again, but I substitute it 1 for 1 in any recipe that calls for salt. So now let's talk about sweeteners. So I will always use honey where honey will work. Muffins, coffee cake, those types of quick breads, I use honey as my sweetener. In quick breads, you typically find that there's a lot more sugar in a conventional white flour, white sugar recipe. So for quick breads, the substitution for honey is going to be cut that honey in half. So like a banana bread, traditional white flour, white sugar banana bread recipe, it usually calls for 2 cups of sugar. I bring that down to 3/4 of a cup of honey. You could do a cup if you wanted a little sweetener, but I find 3/4 a cup works just fine. So the general rule of thumb is to cut the honey in half when you're substituting. Again, flavor, we talked about that last time. Sometimes in my coffee cake or muffins, if I'm using soft white wheat that doesn't have as much flavor as the red, I may choose a milder honey than the bakery grade honey, like clover, something that's a little sweeter. So I usually have some amount of a milder flavored honey around. If you don't want 2 jugs, then I would go with the clover, but the bakery honey is so much more economical. So that's my basic muffins, coffee cake, banana bread, pumpkin bread, those types of recipes. Now we move into cookies. Now, for cookies, my sweetener of choice had to be diverted a little bit, or I had to find a little another sweetener that would adapt a little better to my cookies and cakes and things like that. So oftentimes in cookies and cakes, they may use more sugar than flour. So these might be recipes that we eat in moderation, but honey just seemed to make a cookie dough sticky and wet, and I had to add more flour, and then it ended up being more cakey than a chewy, crispy, soft cookie. So, and the same with cake, like my grandma's sour cream pound cake recipe calls for 3 cups of sugar. Putting 3 cups of honey in that, or even reducing that to 1.5 cups, still gave me a very liquid batter. So years ago, I did find some evaporated cane juice sweeteners. The darker sweetener is called Sucanat, and that is the juice of the sugar cane extracted. All the molasses, everything is still there. It's boiled into a syrup, and then only the moisture evaporated off. So your Sucanat is a wonderful brown sugar substitute. It's got a nice rich flavor, not nearly as sweet as white sugar or even brown sugar, but it just adds a nice rich flavor to your cookies. And I think you'll find that you like your cookies better made with freshly ground flour and your Sucanat as a sweetener. If your recipe calls for brown sugar, say a streusel topping on my coffee cake, that was another thing. We loved coffee cake for breakfast. I couldn't make a streusel topping out of honey. So I was very excited when I found this little less processed sweetener to make my streusel topping out of. So great for substituting anywhere you would use brown sugar. So for white sugar, I discovered honey granules. Now, in my red book, the Becker's recipe collection, you might see this called Sucanat with honey. Sucanat is a brand name of evaporated cane juice, and it's by Wholesome Sweeteners. And we used to carry Sucanat with honey by Wholesome Sweeteners. Now we get it from a different supplier, so we have to call it honey granules. In my Essential Home Ground Flour book, I call this dark evaporated cane juice is what we call Sucanat. Light evaporated cane juice is what we call Sucanat with honey or honey granules. You may see it by those different names. So dark evaporated cane juice, light evaporated cane juice. Why is this light? Take the juice of the sugar cane, boil it into a syrup, remove the molasses, add a mild honey to that syrup, evaporate the moisture off. So that's why it's called honey granules. There is some honey in here. A lot of people mistake it and think it's just evaporated honey. It is not. It is still an evaporated cane juice product. But this is a less processed, less refined sweetener than your white sugar, but an excellent substitute for white sugar. And the nice thing about these sweeteners, you substitute them one for one, and they really don't change the texture or the moisture in the recipe. So especially if I'm trying a recipe for the first time, just want to see what the texture is like, or I've got company coming for dinner and I'm making a new cookie recipe, I will go with these sweeteners over honey because I know I will get the same basic results and texture. One for one, honey granules is a great white sugar substitute. I use it in my grandma's sour cream pound cake, cheesecake, any place that I would use white sugar. You can use it in baking with your bread, but again, I always choose honey if honey will work because it truly is an completely unrefined sweetener. So Sucanat and honey granules. Sucanat, brown sugar, honey granules, white sugar substitutes. One for one, cakes, cookies, wherever you want to put them. So that is my sweeteners of choice for my quick breads, mostly my cakes and cookies. My oil, most times your quick breads will call for some type of oil. Of course, biscuits and cookies and cakes are going to call for butter typically, most cakes, some like carrot cake and spice cakes, they may call for oil. Again, if it calls for a liquid oil, I will use olive oil, and that will be my choice. But then in a cake or a cookie that calls for butter, I'm going to use real butter. And I've chosen to use unsalted butter so that, because the butter that's salted in the store is using refined salt, so that then I can put in my real salt. The other oil that I might use is coconut oil. If your family needs to go dairy-free, or you just want to use coconut oil, or you go to make cookies and you don't have butter, you can always use coconut oil 1 for 1. And coconut oil, the melting point is about 78 degrees, so it can be a great liquid oil if you need a liquid substitute, but it can be a solid oil for your butter in cookies. And I use it 1 for 1. For recipes where I do substitute unsalted butter or coconut oil, I do find that I typically have to increase the salt just slightly, about half again as much as the recipe calls for. So that is my oils, my fats, my sugars, baking powder, my sweeteners, and then soft wheat for your cakes, cookies, biscuits, pie dough, muffins. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, so one last thing before we move on from quick breads is, especially cakes and cookies, biscuits, when you're substituting your freshly milled soft wheat flour for white flour in a recipe. Soft wheat flour is higher moisture, lower protein than your commercial white flours. So what I have discovered is you do need to increase the flour used in the recipe when you're going to substitute your freshly milled soft wheat flour. For instance, and here's the ratio that I've found that works pretty much all the time. For every cup of white flour called for in a recipe, you need to increase, when you're using soft wheat flour, by 1/4 cup. So if your recipe calls for a cup of white flour and you're going to use freshly milled soft wheat flour, whether white or red, you're going to do 1.25 cups of freshly milled soft wheat flour. And it's because of the moisture content there. Now, if your recipe is by weight, so it calls for so many grams or so many ounces of flour, then just weigh your soft wheat flour the exact same amount of weight called for in the recipe, and then mill it into flour and use all of that flour. You don't need to increase the weight. If you measured that out, the reason you don't have to change it if your recipe is by weight is because the volume fixes itself. So if you weighed the white flour and weighed the soft wheat flour, you would find that the soft wheat flour has more flour for that same weight. Does that make sense? So I hope that helps. You will find every cookie recipe works beautifully, increasing 1/4 cup for every cup called for. So let's say a cookie recipe usually calls for 2 cups of flour, white flour. So we're going to use 2.5 cups of soft wheat flour, freshly milled soft wheat flour. And then for me, it usually calls for 1 cup of brown sugar, 1 cup of white sugar. I'll use 1 cup of Sucanat and 1 cup of honey granules. In an oatmeal cookie, I might use all brown sugar. Whatever you normally do for your cookies, that's your substitute. Increase the soft wheat by 1/4 cup for every cup. Use equivalent, equal amounts of honey granules or Sucanat for your brown sugar and your white sugar. And I think you'll like the cookies, the cakes, the cheesecake even better. So enjoy your baking with freshly milled soft wheat flour.